go further than that. They say, I know this Creator's mind. With his authority, I can tell you what you can eat and what not, and with whom to sleep, and what books you may or may not read. And so now at this point we say, now, excuse me, I'm willing to say that though there is no evidence that there is a God, I can't say that there's conclusive evidence that there isn't, but you've gone way beyond what anyone should dare to claim. You're out of the argument. We begin by excluding what is useless and offensive and impossible. And those who say, I can tell you exactly, you have to, if you're Jew, you have to cut off your wife's hair and the foreskin of your son's penis. Otherwise, you're not observing the covenant. Well, excuse me, I know one thing. They don't know that. They can't know that. Catholic Church tells me, I know AIDS is a pain, but you've no idea how God frowns on condoms more than AIDS. And we can make this real to you. I say, no, excuse me, don't talk to me in that tone of voice. I won't have it. I've had enough of this. So Einstein could have been, for all I care, a Mormon. I think incredibly unlikely, right? But Isaac Newton had beliefs that we now laugh at.
Yes.
The great discoverer of oxygen, the great Unitarian Joseph Priestley, who was in his way quite a secularist, nonetheless believed in the phlogiston theory. Alfred Russel Wallace, Darwin's great companion, was, I think, a table rapper and went to seances and things. It doesn't matter. It may not, in their minds it may be compatible. You could be the same person and have these contrasting beliefs, but the beliefs do contrast. And yes, that, of course, you're right to begin with.
This is a little seance called...
well, not contrast, they conflict. I mean, they conflict. I mean, you can't... But it doesn't mean that a very good physicist couldn't be, as one of Einstein's Nobel rivals was in Germany, a Nazi, who thought there was such a thing as Jewish science and Aryan science. He still won the Nobel Prize for Physics. I think we would think that serious study of the cosmos was incompatible with rubbishy beliefs of that sort. But it isn't in the same person incompatible.
This,
see what I mean?
This is, as I was saying before I was so eloquently interrupted, this is a little seance called Late Night Live.
My dear, sorry.
On ABC Radio National.
Well, you did ask me to babble, so I promised I would.
Oh, please. Late Night Live, ABC Radio. I've got to do this, Christopher.
I know, Radio National. The rent must be paid, yeah.
Exactly. Around the world on the web and downloadable onto your pod. And this ectoplasmic outpouring is coming from the lips of Christopher Hitchens. Christopher, quite a few of our fellow atheists confess in their writings, and Dawkins does this, that they had a bit of a struggle to escape the flypaper of faith. As I recall, even Bertrand Russell had to, took some years to get off it. I was never on it. I was an atheist from the age of 5 because I just couldn't see the sense in it. It just didn't.
Yes.
It was just nonsense to me. And this is despite the fact that my father was a Christian minister. When did you realise that you were an atheist?
Well, I describe in the opening pages of the book how a teacher of mine made a huge mistake. A lovely old girl called Mrs. Watts, who taught us nature when I was about 9 and also was our divinity instructor. And one day she said, trying ambitiously, too ambitiously for her, to merge the two, she said, well, children, you see how God is good because he makes all the vegetation to be green and soothing to the eyes, whereas if he'd made it purple and orange, we'd be permanently, having a migraine. So I thought to myself, I was 9, that's nonsense. The vegetation didn't adapt to our eyes. Our eyes adapted to the vegetation. I mean, I knew nothing about chlorophyll or photosynthesis or anything of the sort, but I just knew creationism was for stupid people. And that was an early point. I'd never had any great dogma inflicted on me either at home or at school. Where I was educated in England, it's compulsory to attend these things, but they don't insist you believe it. It's taught as if it's true. So I admire, the huge number of people I know who did have to overcome terrible inculcations, often accompanied by well, you read Bob Hughes's memoirs about doing it in Australia, for example. The frightening things the Jesuits would tell you if you so much as touched your private parts, which the hand is kind of arranged to do.
Let alone anyone else's private parts.
To say nothing of others. Well, as I say in my introduction, according to this theory, you are created sick and then ordered to be well. That is totalitarianism. Well, no, I never fell for any of that, but I do find myself in some sympathy with those who have this struggle, but I do think it has to be recognized that, and there's been some work on cognition and on the brain indicating this more recently, that probably ever since the species began to sort of walk upright and develop a prefrontal lobe, there have been 10 or 15% of people who just can't believe it. It's not so made as that they can. Reason I think it's probably true, this new scientific finding, is that that's who Pascal is writing to in his wonderful Pensées. He says, I'm writing to the person who is so made that they cannot believe. The early psalmist says, the fool has said in his heart there is no God, which means even then, in the sort of stricken deserts of Judea and elsewhere, where you would be in real trouble if it was even suspected that you didn't believe in God. They knew there were people who couldn't do it.
There are
and I am one of them, and apparently you are too. Yeah.
There are hieroglyphs and ancient poems on the papyrus from the valley, the Nile Valley, in which people say, are the gods true? So even then there were at least people who were mildly agnostic. And of course these days the Church of England, which used to be the Conservative Party at prayer, is almost a sort of a haven for agnostics, isn't it?
Well, yes, and many others. I mean, everyone now knows, because religion was the attempt to answer questions that couldn't be answered. Why do we keep getting these plagues? Well, it must be God's punishment. Well, they didn't have a germ theory of disease, did they? We're given dominion in Genesis over all creatures, but it doesn't include microorganisms, because A, they didn't know the microorganisms were there, B, they didn't know that for most of history they've had dominion over us. So religion is from the childhood of the race in that way, the species, and why wouldn't it be? We now know that religion ends and philosophy begins, just like alchemy ended and chemistry began, and astronomy ended and astrology ended and astronomy began.
And yet, Christopher, towards the end of the 20th century, I was reasonably confident that religion was on its last legs, that the God of the gaps was beleaguered, that as knowledge advanced, he was receding, and that at some point in the not too distant future, cathedrals, synagogues, etc., would be museums. Didn't happen, did it?
No, but I differ from you in that you must be even more of a materialist by character or nature than I am, because I never for a second thought that, or you might be upset to hear, wished that it were true. It could be mouth-bringing, I don't know, but a landscape without Gothic architecture would be very upsetting.
Heaven forbid. Yes.
Or without, say, the poetry of George Herbert, or I give you other examples. I don't care much for devotional painting, I must say. I mean, just like as soon as a person in England becomes the poet laureate, which means they have to write about the royal family, they instantly start writing piffle because of the subject matter. Even Leonardo, when he's doing a devotional painting, seems phony to me, but that's just my point of view. I couldn't do without devotional music and architecture and poetry, I must say, and I've never thought that it was eradicable or that anyone should try.
Are you suggesting that there's
I think I'm with Freud. Freud says in The Future of an Illusion, it'll go away, but only on one condition, that we stop being afraid of death.
It seems to me, Christopher,
improbable, I would say.
Well, that's not going to happen, although I've had people on the program lately saying that death is about to disappear thanks to tinkering with the DNA and or by downloading your intellect, and I use yours as a case in point, into some sort of vast database so you can linger on for millennia. But it's always seemed to me that let's deal with this. Yes, religion has given us some pretty impressive art and artefacts and so on. Is that because very talented people had to work within a religious framework to make a quid? Leonardo, case in point?
Well, no, I'm sure it's true maybe not in his case, but it's certainly true we cannot be sure of an architect or a painter that they didn't have to do as their patron requested. But I think it would be very cheap to say that about the poetry of John Donne, say, that he only wrote that way because he knew what side his bread was buttered on. I can't bring myself to say that.
Well, poets don't need the degree of patronage that a painter does.
At least he deeply hoped, and in fact one of his best poems begins, "Death be not proud." because he says